Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda Carney. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week I'm delighted to have Sara Taylor on. Now she is an expert as a consultant and also in-house over many, many years in diversity, equity and inclusion, but she's also a best-selling author with a recent book coming out, so Thinking at the Speed of Bias, and I'll get you to tell us more about this and a previous book in this area. And you are an expert, Sara, and we'll talk more about this in terms of bias and diversity in the workplace. But what we thought, because of the time of year, and it's quite topical, the working title for this might be Politics in the Workplace. We'll play on the politics theme.
Yes.
Sara, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit in more depth?
Absolutely. Love to. First of all, for those that are listening, not watching the video, you don't know that I am a white woman. And you might think, okay, what is a white woman doing in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially for 35 years? Well, I actually, as young as middle school, I was delivering speeches and presentations about discrimination and stereotypes. So it's just been something that I have always been passionate about. So that's really essentially why I have this 35-year career. And have had the wonderful opportunity to work around the globe with all kinds of different organizations. And through that, obviously, work with all kinds of individuals and basically essentially refine tools that are most helpful.
I mean, that's interesting. Sorry to cut over there. What's interesting about that, Sara, for me as well, is that obviously that sounds like it's a vocation for you if you were passionate about this at school. And you've been able to work in this area for 35 years in the US. And I think back to when I've spoken to other US people in this area, because I don't think that DE&I in the UK really was a thing 20 years ago. It would have been wrapped into HR. It really wasn't. So would you say it was the States were further ahead? And why do you think that would be? Or was yours a sort of natural role at the time?
Yes, absolutely. Because it actually evolved from the civil rights movement in the US. Okay. And after the civil rights movement, or as a part of a product of the civil rights movement, we in the US created affirmative action, essentially saying, hey, you know what? If you're not doing enough to bring in, at that time, particularly people of color, then you've got to change some things. So it began with affirmative action, and then organizations started to think, and this was, I don't know, maybe about 40, even 50 years ago, to say, well, this doesn't have to be something that is a have to. It doesn't have to be something that, because back, when there were quotas, those were legally mandated. And organizations said, no, we don't have to do this. This is a good thing. It helps our business. So that's when it just became diversity.
Yes.
And then round about 25 years ago, a gentleman named Roosevelt Thomas said, okay, it's wonderful that we are talking about representation, but gee, don't we want folks to feel included when they're in the workplace? And that's when inclusion was added. But you're very right. And, back 20, even 25 years ago, working with folks throughout Europe, actually, it was kind of this, what is this stuff? Why do we need it?
And there is something there that I don't want to go too political, but we were just talking off camera, weren't we, that we're recording this in August, and it's going to go out before the US election. Obviously, we've just had an election over here, hence the politics link. But
curious actually is that because obviously you're Kamala Harris, for example, a black woman, so that would be a massive, from a point of view of the states, that would seem to be something that there is more prejudice, apparently, over there than there is in many other countries. So I question whether or not, is it that perhaps other countries were more linked so they didn't feel they needed to do it, or would, I don't know, what's your view on that?
Well, across the world, we see disparities. It may be disparities in caste, it may be disparities in gender, it may be disparities with disability, but across the world, we see those disparities. Again, I think the US has a very unique and tumultuous history when it comes to race. And that is a part of our origin story as a country. It is what we have really been founded on, is that division. Now, the unfortunate thing is that today, that image of diversity being just race and specifically just black and white, unfortunately, that's what holds us back. And that's where a lot of the confusion, I think, can come from when you see the anti DEI movement, particularly in politics, calling Kamala Harris a DEI hire. Those kinds of things, unfortunately, perpetuate that misperception that diversity, equity, and inclusion work is only about black and white.
Yeah. So we'll steer clear of the politics from that point on in terms of this podcast, because this is aimed on HR. But we thought this was a great link in terms of, at the end of the day, division. Well, everything, if division can spill over into the workplace, and as you rightly said, it's not just about race, whether or gender or neurodiversity, or there are so many different ways. What's, as you consult into organisations, I assume you are working often with HR, are you? What can HR do about this, or what would you recommend they do to progress this?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, where we really focus, and somebody might say, well, how is a DEI practitioner helping in this area? Well, actually, everything that we do in our work is about how we're perceiving each other, how we're interacting with each other. And what we find is the vast majority of conflicts and misunderstandings, whether they're about politics or they're about the project that we're working on, the vast majority are fueled by misunderstandings coming from our unconscious filters. And so, what we want to do is understand, when we can understand two key things, that first of all, how I interact is based on my filters, because my filters are deciding that for me, for all of us. And we can dive into that more if you'd like. And secondly, how I interact is based on development when it comes to interacting across difference. And there literally are 5 stages of this development. Every one of us is in one of the stages that we have developed to. And when we have folks that are mired in polarization, mired in the conflicts, want to stay in the conflicts, we can actually understand that through the stages of development, because that is a specific stage of development. So essentially, what I'm saying is that by understanding these concepts of how our brain works and how that is tied to our differences, we can better understand the conflicts and misunderstandings that we're in the workplace in order to be more effective.
So self-awareness, and I mean, you can think about that in terms of even individual differences in terms of personality tools. That's a good way of understanding difference too, isn't it? I'd like to understand more about this idea of filters and also your 5 development stages. Which one should come first in terms of understanding it?
Yeah, let's start with the filters. Yeah. Our filters are an automatic mechanism that operates in our unconscious, and they have been evolved and fine-tuned over all of our evolution as human beings to perform three really key functions. And all of this comes from an interdisciplinary work. So from unconscious bias, from psychology, from cultural competence. And so the way we understand filters, three different functions. And I'm going to get at the first actually with a question. How many pieces of information do you think our brains take in just 1 second? You got to guess?
I don't know 1 second, but there is that sort of 5 plus or minus 2, isn't there? There's something about we can only handle certain numbers of data.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you're getting at kind of the second part of the question. The first part is we actually take in 11 million pieces of information. Right. And it's impossible to imagine because of what you mentioned. We can only consciously be aware of 40.
So when you're saying 11 million pieces of information, that's including things like sensory and touching stuff, yes, and bouncing off, all those, yes, sorts of, all of our senses. Yeah.
All of that. Absolutely. Putting my body in the space that I'm in, all kinds of things. But it's also billboards that I passed. It's also, we mentioned elections, and you mentioned, potential prejudice and so forth. If I look at the picture that's on my classroom wall of all of the former presidents or prime ministers of my country, and I see that they're either 100% men or they're 99% men or they're all white or they're all whatever, that also gets input. And so the reality is, even just today, how many hours have I been awake? How many seconds have I been awake? How much information have I taken into my unconscious filters that I don't even agree with consciously?
Right.
So it goes in, and then the second function of the filters is to explain and evaluate and categorize while we're in situations. They use that warehouse of information. I'm in a situation and it picks and chooses from this information that I don't even know is there. And then the third function, that I'll get at this with a question as well. Can you tell me what your next thought is? You can't, can you? That's because, and we know this from Benjamin Libet, who works in the field of brain science, that thought is formed milliseconds before it's passed to our conscious mind. It's formed in our unconscious. So that means we don't have control over what gets input. That's the first function. We don't have control over how our filters are explaining and evaluating and categorizing. Where we can step in is in that last function, when our filters create our thoughts. That's where we've got to get more active. And that then ties to the stages of development.
Okay. So let's go on to that, and I can come back and ask more questions on that. So I think I've got the filters because I feel like there's stuff to explore about when they come in, into what, we develop our when we're children, the sort of whole thing about when you get up to 7, where we're just a sponge and you're taking things in subconsciously, that we might have filters that we've grown up with, as well as you're saying these things that you see around. So I'm interested in your development stages. So let's go on there and then see how they connect.
Yeah. Okay. Fabulous. So these 5 stages, these are research-based stages, originally identified by Milton Bennett. And it is about how we take in differences. So they're progressively developmental. Think about how we develop as humans: infant, toddler, preschooler. You don't skip around in those stages, right? You don't have a toddler that wakes up one day and says, I want to be a preschooler today. You don't skip around. You move developmentally through the stages. Of the 5 stages, the first 3, we are oblivious to our filters. And so those are the ineffective stages, because our filters are deciding for us and we don't know. We just consciously, our filters tell us this is what you do. So in our mind, this becomes right. It becomes good. It becomes professional. Not this is just one option based on my past experiences. So in those first 3 stages, we're oblivious to how our unconscious is creating our world, creating our perceptions, creating our preferences, our decisions, our thoughts. It's not unless and until we move to the latter two stages of development that we're able to first acknowledge the power and actually be more observant of our filters. And then in the very last stage, we're able to check and challenge them. And we're able to say, wait a second, nope, not going to do that. I'm going to do this instead. Now, the unfortunate thing is that a very small percentage of folks have reached that last stage. And there's an assessment that's tied to this particular model. And in global samplings, we see that less than 2% of individuals have made it that far. The vast majority, 85%, are operating in those first three stages. And that's the Debbie Downer news. But the good news is anyone can develop. And that's essentially what our work is.
So how would you get somebody to a point where they because it's almost counter chicken and egg, isn't it? How do you get somebody who is in one of the lower three developmental stages recognize that there's a problem, if you like, or want to step out of that development stage? Or how could we challenge our own thinking, work out where we are in our developmental stages?
Yeah. Well, first is being aware of the stages, but how do you get folks to buy in is what you were really talking about. And honestly, that's a wonderful tie back to DEI work, because you see so many folks that feel disengaged because they don't think that it benefits them. This particular skill benefits everyone. And first, it's going to benefit me when I develop my effectiveness. When you talk to folks about, okay, you're controlled by your unconscious until you move to these latter stages. It's your choice. Here's the developmental process. We can develop you there, or stay controlled by your unconscious. I mean, we don't say it that bluntly, but essentially, that's a pretty good case for this is something that I need to do. When we talk about it as effectiveness, this is my effectiveness. This is me creating misunderstandings that aren't there. And we use a lot of our own personal stories. That really helps people to engage and to be able to see, oh, yeah, I guess there's something in this for me. And then the other piece, because we're talking to folks here that are working in HR in organizations. The other thing is, frankly, will there be some folks that say, I don't care? Yeah, there will. We get folks that say, well, I'm a year away from retirement. Do I really need to do this? Or, for whatever reason, right? So the real question there then is, as an organization, what do we do? And the answer that we have found is very practical and also proven to work, is that we develop a critical mass. So you have a critical mass of folks that are operating in the effective stages. And what we find over and over and over again is, by attrition, the folks that don't develop find their way out. And give you a ton of examples of that. The other piece,
the culture shift. That's you getting a culture shift by that. More and more people are aware and checking in. And I'm thinking, so let's say in environments where there's maybe bullying and harassment or something like there's microaggressions that people culturally are habitually doing. If that becomes frowned on and becomes stopped, then that behavior, you either join them or actually I don't fit in here anymore. And
yes. And absolutely. I'm so glad that you mentioned microaggressions. I actually talk all about them in chapter 8 in my book. And essentially, microaggressions are created by our filters.
Yeah.
So we already established, right? Our filters create our thoughts. Well, what do our thoughts create? Our actions. So every single one of our actions, whether they're inclusive or exclusive, whether they create a microaggression or not, it originated with a filter. And what we can do is actually, in the patterns that we see of microaggressions, we can identify corresponding patterns of how our filters are working. And so the more we're aware of that, the more we're able to check and challenge them. But the piece you were getting at was organizationally.
Yeah.
Organizationally, what do we do?
Yeah.
The vast majority of our organizations are operating in that third stage. because the vast majority of individuals are operating there. And so what they do is they create then filter-driven organizations where they don't even realize that they are reinforcing and perpetuating filter-driven policies, filter-driven behaviors, and many times the ones that they are reinforcing and perpetuating are tied to the dominant culture.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to me, it sounds almost like filters and culture are really intrinsic.
Yes.
It's not the same.
Yes.
Can you change your filters, or is it just about awareness?
You can't change necessarily the filters. You can kind of shift them over time to be something different, but the real power is having that ability to check and challenge them in the moment. And when you mention culture, I do want to say, because I think this is the other thing. Your other question was, how do we help people understand? And the other way we help them really identify their filters is by understanding the three types. So the three types of individuals, one of them is cultural, and I call them group. So whatever, because folks perceive culture as just country culture, more or less. But we're really talking about any group that we're a part of, and the norms that come from that group. Those are input, over and over and over again. You talked about the 7-year-old, that by 7 years old, how much have you got input from your culture of this is the way to be? Those are group filters because they're tied to the groups that we're a part of. Individual filters, on the other hand, aren't tied to any group that I'm a part of. They're more preferences. I prefer small talk, as an example. That's a preference. You don't see that everybody that looks like me prefers small talk. No, you don't see that pattern. Okay. So it's individual, then group, and then systemic. Systemic also don't tie to groups, but they are shared broadly within society. These are the stereotypes. And we learn about systemic filters from the field of unconscious bias. But the really important thing, one more thing I want to say about this, is that think of them in that order: individual, then group, then systemic. Probably most of us that are listening or work in this field, we want to eliminate inequities, right? We want to eliminate systemic inequities. That's the tough one. And we're not going to get there until we are able to check and challenge the easier filters. So individual, group, systemic, those are in a specific order from easier to more difficult to identify, easier to more difficult to be conscious of, easier to more difficult to talk about, easier to more difficult to actually shift and challenge. Yet they are also in order from trivial to more serious.
Yeah.
And so the mistake that we have made in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion for decades is we see the systemic equities and we say, okay, just don't do that anymore. Well, we haven't developed the skill for people to not do that anymore.
So that's interesting because I was trying to think of the practicality. I'm feeling like DEI tends to be more about awareness of group, if I'm understanding things. So I don't know how much you talk about individual. I'm not sure how much we talk about systemic in reality. And I wondered also, one of the sort of fashions, if you like, in the last 10 years was unconscious bias training, but also there was a reasonable amount of pushback that said that it wasn't very effective. And I wonder whether that again plays into the point that you're making.
Yes.
It is going after a group, but we're not actually getting at the root of it in terms of individual filters, and there's more systemic stuff. And so is systemic, could you redefine what the systemic one is for me?
So systemic, we're not conscious of, and they tie to stereotypes. So let's go back to that 11 million pieces of information. As I said, I'm a woman. How much information have I even taken in already today that might be stereotypical even against me and my identity as a woman that tells me, Sarah, you shouldn't have a job. You should be at home. You definitely shouldn't be a leader. You definitely shouldn't own a business. You definitely shouldn't be, traveling the world and presenting. No, that should be your husband. How much information have I taken in like that? I don't
Yeah.
know. And some of that is stereotypical. Some of it, again, I can look at the picture in my classroom of the presidents of my country and see there's no one like me. And so that's also actual information. All of that gets soaked up by our systemic filters and it's reinforced. So, systemic filters reinforce and perpetuate and come from stereotypes. And
Of course, and actually now with social media, and it not necessarily social media, what you're seeing around you, which isn't always fact. I know not everything's everywhere is fact, but actually that's bringing more and more of that
yes,
systemic information for us to
yes,
take on, absorb.
yes, and it flies across our screens in seconds.
Yeah.
And our filters don't need a second as a lifetime for our filters. They take in a ton of information. And so, again, that's what makes it so difficult. And so, if I'm not able to stop the judgments about someone that doesn't like small talk, the easy one, how the heck am I going to stop and identify when I've got judgments about someone that looks different from me? As an example.
So I certainly, it's quite complex. And as you're saying, the first point is really getting people to acknowledge it or be motivated to take a step back for this and what's in it for them. So if we're looking at, say, our leaders in the workplace or HR, and we want to change it, what you did say earlier, you can move by moving people up the organization, getting more people into that self-awareness, you create
yes.
a new culture.
Yes.
I mean, what would you recommend? So, is it in summary, if we would say HR or leaders, if you want to do something about this, to challenge this, what would you say are the most practical things people can do?
Yeah, well, what individuals can start doing is, again, learn about your filters, know that they're there. And we see this huge light bulb go off for folks when it's all of a sudden this, oh my gosh, I had no idea. And that's a huge transformation. As organizations, really decide, it's very probable. Yeah, for anybody listening, if you haven't done development work, I would literally place a bet that your organization is operating in that third, the last of the ineffective stages. So you really need to make a decision. Are you going to continue doing work organizationally from that stage of development? Or are you going to do the developmental work so you can do more transformational work? I call it transactional transactions, or excuse me, I call it tractionless transactions. When we're operating in that third stage, it's okay, well, we're supposed to do employee resource groups. We're supposed to do this, that, or the other. Or, okay, everyone, go be inclusive. Just go do that. Well, we haven't developed the skills to do any of that.
So it's almost lip service. You're saying that people might think they're further up. Then when they're in, do they have names, those first?
Yes, they do. They do. And I'm going to use my terminology for them just because they're a little bit easier to understand. The first is oblivious, not even seeing easy to see differences. The second is polarization. We talked a bit about that. Us, them, good, bad, stereotypes, actively promoting stereotypes. The third is minimization. I'm minimizing differences and focusing on commonalities. So instead of saying it's saying things like, well, we have shifting demographics, those kinds of terminology that we hear all the time.
So it's lip service, the kind of lip service. So at that stage, you can see it's almost the most dangerous one because people think they are self-aware and inclusive, but they're not really embracing it, or they're not doing positive stuff with it.
Yes.
They're driving it forwards. Just for completion, what are 4 and 5 called?
Then 4, for me, I call it acknowledging, and it's acknowledging, acknowledging and taking accountability for our filters. And then the last is actually shifting our filters, adaptation. So I'm able to adapt in the situations that I'm in. But you touched on something, Lucinda, about we think we're more effective. actually, that is measured by that same assessment tool. And what we know is before doing development work in general population, between 95 to 99% of us have a significant gap between how effective we actually are and how effective we think we are. So why do this work? I'm great. I'm fabulous. I'm respectful. I'm a nice guy. I don't mean harm. All of that speaks to
I'm not
our
sexist, racist, I'm
yes, right.
totally inclusive, absolutely. So how can people? You're talking about this tool. Is it open? Is it available to others? This survey tool. Is this something that you guys use? How can people assess their
Yeah, they could certainly, unfortunately they need it. It's not one of these assessments you can just log in online and take it, unfortunately. But they could go to our website and we can point them to it. So to Deep Sea Consulting, that's
C
DEEP.
as in E as in look, as opposed to
Yes, Deep Sea Consulting. Yep. And we can get one for them and would love to do that.
Yeah, I will do. So Sarah, I think maybe just wrapping up, that's something to look at, understanding more, reflecting on these development stages, reflecting on our filters, or even getting people to talk about their filters is going to be quite key. And I'm interested as well. I was thinking one of the things when your publicist got in contact with me originally, she was saying that there's lots of stressors about people, conflict in the workplace, and even like discussing politics in the workplace. So I suppose particularly for our American listeners, you're going into a bit of a heated time. You've got to work with people who who don't agree on their politics. That's going to happen because you have got a very split company there, and they're not necessarily all going to share politics. What are your top tips there in terms of leaders avoiding the politics in the workplace as opposed to internal politics? Any top tips for resolving and supporting there?
Yeah, absolutely. And the wonderful thing is we can rely on research and tie it even to that model. We know that just developmentally, if we are in that polarization stage, what do we need to focus on to develop? We focus on commonalities. And even if we aren't in that stage, even if we have developed farther along, there may be situations that are polarizing situations.
Exactly where my brain went then, actually. So I was just thinking, oh, okay, I might think that I'm in a certain place developmentally in the workplace, but if you were to ask me my view on certain politicians, I'm quite polarized because I believe my view is right. And that's being polarized, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And, the reality is that kind of polarization. So beyond politics, it seeps into the workplace all the time. You get somebody in a meeting that says, oh my gosh, who invited the engineers? They're clueless. That's a polarizing statement. So what do we typically do in the workplace, whether it's politics or not? We do the kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and we go along with them. Oh yeah, the engineers, da, 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 da. Well, what if we didn't get into that polarization spiral? Yes. What if we focused on commonalities? Well, you know what? I think that those engineers want what's best for this project just like we do. And you know what? I've got some ideas. I'm sure they've got some ideas too. Let's go into this with an open mind. Same thing with politics. I'm sure we all want what's best for this country or for this situation or whatever it might be. So focusing on those commonalities, or even because the challenge in the workplace also is we might be sitting next to someone that we know has all of these political differences, and it's, kind of getting in the way. I know for some folks, this seems like a cop-out, but we're not going to be able to change their mind. What we can do is focus on where we do have commonalities. We both love dogs. We both have kids, whatever it is. And one other that this is, I think, probably the most helpful tip, because I see organizations fall into this pitfall all the time. What do they do when folks in their organization there's a kind of a polarization rise? We saw it here in the US, and folks may have seen it across the world after George Floyd's murder, where you had groups in the organization rising up and saying, our organization is awful, we're racist, we're this, we're that, we're the other, right? And What did we see leadership do? Respond to that polarization with a ton of information. No, well, we do this. Well, we've done that. Well, we've done this. We've done the other. Actually, what we know from that developmental place, information puts us even more firmly into polarization.
People defend it. They try to defend against it, or sort of dig their heels in and force their position.
Yes.
So what do you do instead then? Sorry.
So instead of sending more information, what those leaders, what we encourage them to do is to think about ways to join arms and to find common goals. You know, we all want an inclusive workplace. We all want the best company, the best organization we can have. And I'm sure we all have a different perspective on what that can be. Can we come together and talk about it? Mm-hmm. That's more, okay, let's open. Let's be open to this instead of you stated your point, I'm going to state my point. And what ends up happening? You just keep going farther down your own paths. And even when we hear people, and it just makes me cringe because I hear this all the time when folks talk particularly about political polarization. And they'll say, well, you know, if you're, you typically watch the news from the left, you need to watch the news from the right. Well, if you typically watch the news from the right, you need to watch the news from the left, whatever, you know, that may be. All they're doing is saying, how can you get more entrenched in polarization? And there's actually studies that show that.
So seek commonality. That's really, really the key.
That's what we need to do.
And the interesting thing also, I just think observation of that, where people, going back to your engineers example, which as people often people avoid conflict, so they don't stop, they don't call out that, they just go, oh yeah, go with it. Whereas actually what you're saying, you've got to be brave enough to say, you don't have to say you're wrong, because that's also proto, but they can contribute a lot. I believe in the power of the engineer, whatever it might be, but being able to challenge, not just let it go, challenge, but by looking at commonality.
Yeah, and that's our job as HR. It's setting those boundaries. You know, that's not helpful for us, you know, so hey, let's take another approach.
Leaders should challenge it, and we should encourage other people and recognize others for doing it.
Yeah.
Sarah, just to mention, I'll give a shout out, and you can obviously say how people can get in touch. I think you've just mentioned your website, so Deep Sea Consulting, but your book is just out, was out on July the 9th. Thinking at the Speed of Bias, How to Shift Our Unconscious Filters, if people want to find out more about this topic. And you also previously authored Filter Shift, How Effective People See the World. So if this is something that's whet your appetite to know more about this topic, and it's a nice different angle, I think, in terms on DEI, much very personalized too, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You get in touch. So Sarah, thank you so much for being on the podcast. If you want to share any other websites or anything, I'll put them on the links, but feel free to wrap up or share how people can contact you if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. LinkedIn is a great way. Again, through the Deep Sea site is also a great way.
Brilliant. Lovely. Thank you so much for joining me today on the HR Uprising podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thanks to all your listeners.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.